The day Elijah Dawson walked into Thornfield Capital's boardroom, 3 people laughed, not out loud. They were too polished for that. It was the kind of laugh that lives behind the eyes. A quick flicker, a shared glance across the mahogany table, the small, satisfied smile of people who have already decided what they're looking at before they've heard a single word. Elijah Dawson was 51 years old. He was wearing a Navy suit that had cost him $400 at a shop on Bloor Street, which to him felt like a reasonable investment, and to the people in that room felt like confirmation of everything they'd already assumed. His shoes were clean but not Italian. His briefcase was leather but not monogrammed. He had gray at his temples and calluses on his right hand from 30 years of holding a pen, and when he sat down at the far end of the table, the woman to his left, Margot Ellison Price, chief investment officer, 3rd generation of money, actually shifted her chair 2 inches away from him. She thought she was being subtle. She was not. Here's what Margot Ellison Price did not know about Elijah Dawson. He had rebuilt the financial framework for a mid-sized municipality in northern Ontario after their comptroller ran off with 18 months of operating funds. He had testified before a provincial committee at 38. He had turned down a position in Ottawa twice, not because he wasn't qualified, but because his mother was sick and Halifax needed him more than Parliament did. He had raised a daughter alone after his wife passed, put her through Dalhousie on a salary that most people in this room spent on quarterly ski trips, and he had done all of this quietly, without announcement, the way people do things when they've never had the luxury of an audience. None of that was visible in the Navy suit. None of that registered behind the eyes of the people in that room. What registered was, black man, wrong neighborhood, probably a diversity hire. Dawson opened his briefcase and set 3 folders on the table. He did not introduce himself yet. He let the silence sit there for a moment, the way you let a room settle before you start speaking. And then he said, simply, "I've reviewed the Harrington portfolio. You have a problem." The man at the head of the table, Jeffrey Preston, 62, 3rd-generation partner, the kind of handsome that comes from never having worried about anything, looked at Dawson over the rim of his reading glasses and said, "We're aware there are some irregularities." Irregularities. Dawson said, "Not a question, not an argument, just the word, sitting there, doing its work." Preston cleared his throat. This was not how the meeting was supposed to go. Elijah Dawson had not come to Thornfield Capital looking for trouble. He had come because the firm's junior compliance officer, a young woman named Priya Mehta, who had been quietly terrified for 6 weeks and had finally called the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario, had flagged something in the Harrington account that she couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. The FSRA had sent Dawson. He had been with the regulatory authority for 11 years. He was, by every objective measure, the best person they had for exactly this kind of case. Preston had not been informed of this. He had been told a regulatory contact would be coming by to discuss the Harrington matter. He had expected someone junior. He had expected paperwork. He had expected, if he was being honest with himself, someone who would sit politely at the far end of this table and take notes while Preston explained away whatever needed explaining. He had not expected Elijah Dawson. And Elijah Dawson had seen Jeffrey Preston before. Not Preston specifically, but the type. The firm jaw, the easy entitlement, the way a man who has never been questioned looks at a man he assumes he can dismiss. Dawson had been in rooms like this since he was 32 years old. He had been underestimated in rooms exactly like this, by men exactly like this, and he had learned something over the years that people like Preston never quite grasped. Being underestimated is not a disadvantage. Not if you know how to use it. He set the first folder in front of Preston and watched the man's eyes move across the first page. To his credit, Preston's expression barely changed. Just a slight tightening around the mouth, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching. Dawson was always watching. "Where did you get this?" Preston said. "Your own records," Dawson said, "filed with FSRA over the past 36 months. Margot Ellison Price, still 2 inches away, leaned forward now. Her whole posture had shifted. Dawson noticed that too. The thing about the Harrington portfolio is that it looked fine from a distance. Most bad things do. Raymond Harrington was 74 years old, a retired infrastructure contractor from Sudbury who had sold his company in 2019 for just over $4 million and entrusted that money, his entire retirement, the thing he had spent 40 years building, to Thornfield Capital. on the recommendation of a golf buddy who knew Preston. The kind of referral that happens in certain circles. The kind that doesn't require due diligence because the whole system is built on the assumption that people like Jeffrey Preston don't need to be checked. For the first 2 years, everything looked fine. Quarterly statements showing modest, responsible returns, the language of security, the language of trust. Then Priya Mehta had started at Thornfield. She was 26 years old, fresh from Ryerson, and she had been assigned to audit the Harrington file as a training exercise. The sort of thing no one pays attention to, because the assumption is that training exercises are for learning, not for finding anything. Priya found something. It took her 3 weeks to be sure she wasn't wrong. She ran the numbers 4 times. She called her professor from second year, described the situation without names, and listened to his silence before he said carefully, "You need to take this somewhere official." She had gone to her supervisor first. Her supervisor had gone to Preston, and then nothing. A meeting she wasn't invited to. A follow-up email she sent that was never answered. A Friday afternoon when she passed Preston in the hallway, and he looked through her like she was to furniture. That was when she called the FSRA. And that was how Elijah Dawson ended up in this room on a Tuesday in March, in a Navy suit that cost $400, setting a folder in front of a man who had decided, from the moment Dawson walked through the door, that this was something he could manage. "I'd like to take a break," Preston said. "Of course," Dawson said. Preston stood. The 2 other partners, a man named Whitfield and a woman whose name Dawson had not been given, which was itself a small piece of information, followed him out. Margot Ellison Price stayed. She was looking at the folder the way people look at something they wish they'd seen sooner. "How long have you known about this?" she asked. 3 weeks, Dawson said. "Since Ms. Mehta's report." Ellison Price closed her eyes briefly. "Priya, she did the right thing," Dawson said. "At significant personal cost, I'd imagine." "Yes," Ellison Price said quietly. "She would have." There was a moment between them that didn't need explanation. Dawson let it sit. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "what happens now?" "That depends somewhat on what Mr. Preston says when he comes back in," Dawson said. "But the FSRA's position is already established. The Harrington funds were misallocated. The statements were misleading. The question at this point is whether this firm cooperates in the recovery process or whether we move to formal enforcement." Ellison Price looked at him for a long moment. "You've done this before." "Many times," Dawson said. "They laughed," she said, "Jeffrey and Whitfield, when you walked in." Dawson nodded, once slowly. "I know." She looked down at the folder. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Dawson said. "Be useful." Preston came back in with a lawyer. This was expected. The lawyer was young, expensive-looking, and had the specific energy of someone who had been briefed in a hallway in 4 minutes and was now performing confidence. He set his own folder on the table, thinner than Dawson's, and said something about procedural concerns and the firm's cooperation with regulatory bodies and the importance of establishing a timeline. Dawson let him finish. Then Dawson opened the second folder. The second folder was different from the first. The first folder was the problem. The second folder was the paper trail of every conversation Thornfield Capital had had about the problem before Priya Mehta ever picked up the phone. Internal emails, calendar entries. A memo dated 9 months earlier, signed by a mid-level analyst named Carter, who no longer worked at the firm, which described the Harrington discrepancies in clear, specific language and recommended an immediate internal review. The memo had never resulted in an internal review. The lawyer stopped performing. Preston, for the first time since Dawson had sat down, looked genuinely uncertain. It was not an expression his face was accustomed to forming. "Where did you?" He started. "Carter filed a whistleblower complaint with the Ontario Securities Commission 8 months ago," Dawson said. "It was cross-referenced with Ms. Mehta's report when she contacted FSRO." He paused. "This isn't an irregularity, Mr. Preston. This is a pattern." The room went quiet in a way that was different from before. Before, the quiet had been polite, performative, the quiet of people waiting for someone they've decided to dismiss. This was a different kind of quiet altogether. "I'd like to speak to my lawyer privately," Preston said. "You've already spoken to your lawyer privately," Dawson said. "What I'd suggest now is that you listen." And Jeffrey Preston, 62 years old, third-generation partner, the man who had shifted his chin upward when Elijah Dawson walked into this room, sat down and listened. "What happened after that move through the legal system the way these things do?" Not quickly, not cleanly, but steadily, with the weight of documentation behind it. Raymond Harrington was notified. He drove down from Sudbury with his daughter, a woman in her 40s named Carol, who had been quietly suspicious for a year but had no way to prove anything, and he sat across a table from Dawson at the FS offices on Bay Street, and Dawson walked him through the findings in plain language, without jargon, without condescension, the way Dawson had always believed people deserved to receive information about their own lives. Harrington didn't say much during that meeting. He was a big man, the kind of big that comes from decades of physical work, and he sat with his hands folded on the table and listened. Near the end, he asked one question. "How much is recoverable?" "We believe most of it," Dawson said. "It'll take time, but the firm has assets. The documentation is solid. We have a strong case." Harrington nodded. He looked at his daughter. Something passed between them that wasn't words. Then he looked back at Dawson and said, "They treated you like you didn't know what you were doing when you walked in there, didn't they?" Dawson smiled just slightly. "They did, but you knew exactly what you were doing." "I've been doing this for 11 years, Dawson said. Harrington shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when something both surprises and doesn't surprise him at all. "Good," he said. "I'm glad it was you. The thing that nobody tells you about being underestimated for long enough is that eventually it stops being a wound and becomes a kind of tool." Elijah Dawson had learned that somewhere in his late 30s, in another city, in another room full of people who had made their minds up before he opened his mouth, he had learned that the moment someone decides you're not worth paying attention to, they stop protecting themselves from you. They say things they wouldn't say to someone they considered a peer. They leave gaps in their story. They assume that because you seem to them like someone on the outside of power, you must be. They forget to check what you know. They forget to ask who you know. They forget that the quietest person in the room might be the one who's already spoken to 2 provincial regulators, cross-referenced 3 years of financial filings, and built a documentation package that will hold up in any court in Ontario. Dawson had not forgotten any of that. He never did. Jeffrey Preston resigned from Thornfield Capital in April, 6 weeks after the meeting in the boardroom. The firm entered into a settlement agreement with FSRA and the OSC. The terms were not public, but the outcome was Raymond Harrington received a full recovery of the misallocated funds, with interest, by the end of the fiscal year. Priya Mehta was a period in professional limbo. Her contract at Thornfield was not renewed, an action that Dawson noted in his formal report as retaliatory in character and inconsistent with Ontario whistleblower protections. The FSRA's legal team took that note seriously. Mehta was offered a position with the regulatory authority itself within 3 months, at a salary that was meaningfully better than what Thornfield had been paying her. She sent Dawson a brief email when she got the offer. It said only, "Thank you for writing what you saw." Dawson read it twice, then filed it in a folder he kept for exactly this reason. Not evidence, not documentation, just the small accumulated proof that the work mattered. Margot Ellison Price cooperated fully with the investigation. It came out later that she had raised concerns about the Harrington account internally 8 months before Mehta ever saw it, and had been told by Preston to focus on her own portfolio. She was not charged. She restructured the firm's compliance processes after Preston's departure and brought in an independent auditor for the first time in the firm's 40-year history. Whether this was conscience or self-preservation is a question Dawson chose not to spend energy on. He had other files. On a Thursday in late May, Dawson drove back up to Sudbury. He didn't have to. The formal work was done. There was no professional reason to make the 3.5-hour drive north on Highway 69, past the Canadian Shield, rock cuts, and the long stretches of pine that flatten out as you get closer to the Nickel City. He went because Raymond Harrington had called him the week before and said, simply, "Come up if you can. I'll make dinner." They ate at Harrington's kitchen table. Roast chicken, potatoes, a bottle of something red that Harrington had clearly saved for an occasion. Harrington's daughter Carol was there, and her husband and 2 grandchildren who ran through the kitchen twice and were then dispatched to another part of the house by Carol's husband with the practiced efficiency of someone who has redirected children many times before. Harrington poured the wine and they sat there in the particular comfort of people who don't need to say much to each other. I kept thinking, Harrington said eventually, about what would have happened if that young woman hadn't called. Priya, you'd have gotten your quarterly statement, Dawson said. It would have looked fine. Right, Harrington said, and I'd have believed it. He turned the wine glass in his hand. Because why wouldn't I? You trust people like that, or I did, because of how they look, how they talk, where their offices are. He shook his head. 40 years building something. You'd think I'd know better than to trust the suit. It's not about knowing better, Dawson said. They're built to be trusted. The whole thing is built to make you trust it. You weren't, though, Harrington said. The way they looked at you when you walked in. Carol was there. She saw it. Carol, from across the table, nodded. And you just, Harrington made a gesture that meant, proceeded anyway, continued, did not flinch. It's not the first time, Dawson said. Doesn't it wear on you? Dawson thought about this genuinely, the way he tried to think about most things. Not the polished answer, not the answer that sounds right, but the actual true thing. Some days, he said. But then I think about what the alternative looks like. Going home, letting Preston explain it away to someone who needs the explanation to be right. Harrington in Sudbury not knowing. He set down his glass. I'd rather be tired than absent. Harrington looked at him for a long moment. Then he raised his glass. To Priya Mehta, he said. To Priya Mehta, Dawson agreed. They drank. Outside, the late May light was doing what it does in northern Ontario. Holding on longer than you expect, gold going slowly orange over the tree line. The kind of evening that feels like an argument against the idea that the world is only what it looks like in the cities. The grandchildren were audible somewhere in the house, the specific sound of children who have temporarily forgotten that adults exist. Elijah Dawson drove back south after dinner, past the rock cuts and the pines, with the radio low and the window cracked, and somewhere south of Perry Sound it occurred to him, not for the first time, but with the particular clarity that comes at the end of a long case, that the most dangerous thing about power is not that it's loud, it's that it expects you to stay quiet. He had never been very good at that.